They built 196 homes on my land and thanked themselves for the opportunity. The first thing I noticed wasn't the houses, it was the smell. Fresh asphalt baking under a Texas sun, thick and bitter, mixing with cut lumber and wet concrete. It hit the back of my throat before I even killed the engine. My tires crunched over gravel that used to belong to my father, each turn of the wheels sounding wrong, like I was trespassing on my own life. I stepped out slowly, heat pressing against my skin, the air buzzing with nail guns popping in rapid bursts and generators humming like a swarm of insects. Rows of identical rooftops stretched across the horizon, 196 of them, clean lines, fresh paint, perfect lawns not yet grown in. A whole neighborhood where there used to be open land and a quiet line of oak trees my dad planted with his bare hands. I didn't say a word. Not when I saw the survey flags stabbed into the dirt like bright plastic warnings. Not when a construction worker walked past me without a second glance, boots dragging dust across soil that legally had my name on it. And definitely not when I saw the sign at the entrance. Willow Creek Estates. Established 2025. The bold black letters stood on a polished stone slab, like it had always been there, like my family never existed. You ever feel that moment when something's so wrong your brain just pauses? That was me, standing there, hands in my pockets, tasting concrete dust in the air, listening to someone else build a future on land I inherited, protected, and never sold. My name is Lucas Grant. I'm 38 years old, and every inch of those 82 acres was passed down to me from my father, who got it from his. This land wasn't just property. It was lines on a map my father drew himself, a licensed surveyor who spent 40 years proving that boundaries matter. He used to tell me, "Son, people will argue about anything except what's written in the ground." Turns out, he was half right. Because as I stood there watching strangers frame houses where I used to walk fence lines, I realized something else. People don't respect lines unless you force them to. A white SUV rolled slowly down the newly paved road, tires whispering over blacktop that hadn't even fully set. It stopped beside me, engine idling smooth and quiet. The window rolled down, and there she was. Victoria Hale, HOA president. Perfect hair, sunglasses too expensive for this heat, smile sharp enough to cut glass. She looked at me like I was a delivery guy who got lost. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice sweet but hollow. I glanced past her, at the houses, at the streets, at the life she thought she owned. Then I looked back at her and shook my head once. "No," I said calmly. "I'm just looking." And that was the truth. I was looking at every detail, every mistake, every inch they built without realizing one thing. I hadn't come here to stop them. I came to watch them finish. I grew up measuring land before I ever understood what it was worth. My father did not teach me bedtime stories. He taught me boundary lines. I can still hear the scrape of his boots against dry soil, the metallic click of his measuring tape snapping back into place, the smell of sunburned grass and old cedar posts baked under August heat. He would stand there with his transit level, one eye closed, the other locked onto a point hundreds of feet away, and he would say, "Lucas, land does not lie. People do." Back then, I thought he was just talking about fences and neighbors arguing over inches. I did not realize he was preparing me for something like this. Our property stretched just over 80 acres, rolling Texas ground that never needed to prove itself to anyone. No fences on most sides, just natural lines, tree clusters, a dry creek bed that curved like a scar across the lower section. I learned every inch of it the way other kids learn video games. I knew where the soil turned soft after rain, where the wind cut hardest in winter, where the property markers sat buried just beneath the surface like quiet witnesses. When my father passed, the paperwork came in a thick envelope that smelled like dust and ink, official seals pressed into pages that had more weight than anything I owned. The deed had been updated, recorded, stamped, and verified down to the smallest coordinate. He had even included his original survey maps, hand-annotated in the margins with notes only he would understand. At the time, I filed it away, locked it in a fireproof box, and went back to living my life. I had a job in Austin, consulting on small development projects, nothing glamorous, just enough to pay bills and keep things steady. I checked on the land once every few weeks, drove out, walked the perimeter, listened to the wind move through the trees. It was quiet, predictable, mine. That is why what I saw now felt so surreal. Because none of this happened overnight. It never does. Somewhere between my routine visits and my trust in paperwork, something shifted. Someone filed something. Someone approved something. And while I was busy living a normal life, they were redrawing lines that were never theirs to touch. I crouched down near what used to be the southern boundary, brushing aside loose dirt with my fingers. The soil was different here now, compacted, disturbed, carrying the faint chemical smell of construction runoff. My fingertips hit something solid. I cleared a little more, and there it was. The original survey marker. Steel, rusted at the edges, exactly where it had always been. I looked up from that point, tracing the invisible line forward, straight through the middle of what was now a paved street, with freshly painted curbs and identical mailboxes spaced every 20 feet. They did not move the land. They moved the story. And standing there, with the hum of distant machinery and the heat pressing down on my shoulders, I finally understood what my father meant. Land does not lie, but people will build an entire neighborhood pretending it does. I stood up, wiped the dirt from my hands, and for the first time since I arrived, I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I had just found the first piece of evidence they did not even know they left behind. I did not go home after that. I drove straight into town, dust still clinging to my boots, the taste of grit sitting heavy in the back of my mouth as the image of that marker replayed over and over in my head. The courthouse sat exactly where it always had, red brick faded by decades of sun, the air inside cooler but thick with the smell of paper, ink, and time. Every step echoed slightly against the tile floor as I walked toward the records office, the same place my father used to bring me when I was a kid, telling me that every inch of land worth anything had a paper trail longer than most people's memories. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up, just slid a form toward me like this was another routine request, another name, another file. That was the first mistake they all made. They thought this was routine. I filled out the request slowly, writing my name in clear block letters, Lucas Grant, then the parcel number I had memorized years ago without ever thinking it would matter like this. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead filled the silence while she disappeared into the back room. I stood there, hands resting lightly on the counter, feeling the faint vibration of printers running somewhere behind the wall. When she came back, she carried a stack thicker than I expected. That was the second mistake they made. They left too much behind. I took the documents and moved to one of the wooden tables by the window, sunlight cutting across the pages in sharp lines. The top file was recent, clean, stamped within the last year. Zoning change approval. Agricultural to residential development. My eyes moved faster now, scanning signatures, dates, approval chains. City planning, county office, environmental clearance. All of it looked official. Too official. Then I saw it. A single line buried halfway down the page. Survey reference updated per revised boundary assessment. My fingers paused on that sentence, the paper suddenly feeling heavier. Revised by who? Based on what? I flipped to the attached survey map, and there it was, clean lines, precise measurements, everything neat and professional. But I knew those lines. And they were wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not enough for someone who never walked the land to notice. But off. Shifted. Just enough to slide an entire development across a boundary that had never moved in decades. About 12 feet, maybe a little more in some sections. Enough to turn my land into theirs on paper without touching a single physical marker in the ground. I leaned back in the chair, wood creaking softly under my weight, and let out a slow breath. That was how they did it. Not with force. Not with noise. With paperwork. With confidence. With the assumption that nobody would check. My father always said the most dangerous lie is the one written clean. Enough to look like truth. I kept digging. Permit approvals tied to that revised survey. Construction authorizations. Utility layouts. Mortgage filings already attached to individual lots. They did not just plan this. They executed it fully. Sold it. Packaged it. Turned it into something that looked permanent. Outside the window, I could see people walking past, normal life moving on like nothing had changed. Inside, I was holding the blueprint of how they rewrote my land without ever asking me. I stacked the papers neatly, tapping the edges against the table until they aligned perfectly. Then I smiled again, slower this time. Because now I understood the scale of what they had done. And more importantly, I understood the scale of what would happen when it unraveled. They did not just cross a line. They built an entire neighborhood 12 feet into a mistake. I did not hire a lawyer that day. That would have been the obvious move, the expected move, the move they were prepared for. Instead, I drove back out to the property just before sunset, when the light turns everything gold and soft and almost makes bad decisions look beautiful. The construction noise had quieted down to a low hum, generators winding down, distant voices echoing between half-finished houses. The air still carried that mix of fresh paint and hot asphalt, but underneath it I could smell the land again, faint but still there, like it was waiting. I walked past the entrance sign without stopping this time, boots landing steady on pavement that should not have existed, counting steps without thinking, measuring distance the way my father taught me. 12 feet. That number sat in my head like a ticking clock. I stopped in the middle of what they called Maple Ridge Drive, though there had never been a maple tree within 50 miles of this place, and looked straight down the line of houses. Each one sat perfectly aligned, driveways clean, fences not yet installed, foundations poured with machine precision. And every single one of them, whether they knew it or not, crossed that invisible line. I crouched again, pressing my palm flat against the concrete. It was still warm, holding the heat of the day, smooth and solid under my fingers. Permanent, that is what they thought they built. I stood up and turned slowly, taking it all in, not with anger, not with panic, but with something colder. Calculation. Because this was bigger than a land dispute now. This was contracts, mortgages, insurance policies, utility agreements, every legal layer stacked on top of a mistake they did not even see. A truck rolled past me slowly, headlights flicking on as dusk settled in. The driver barely glanced in my direction. To them, I was just another guy standing in a neighborhood that already belonged to someone else. That was their third mistake. They assumed ownership because it looked complete. I walked to the edge of one of the lots and saw a freshly installed mailbox, the metal still clean, the numbers crisp and new. I ran my fingers lightly across it, then looked past it toward where the real boundary sat, buried just under disturbed soil and ignored by every blueprint they followed. They did not remove the truth. They just built over it. I pulled my phone out and took a slow panoramic photo, capturing the street, the houses, the alignment, every detail that would matter later. Not for proof, for timing, because now I had something they did not expect. I knew exactly how wrong this was, and they did not know that I knew. That is a dangerous imbalance. I slid my phone back into my pocket and exhaled slowly, the evening air cooler now, carrying the distant chirp of insects starting up for the night. I could have stopped them weeks ago, maybe even months, filed an injunction, raised questions, forced inspections. But standing there, looking at 196 nearly completed homes, I realized something simple. The bigger the structure, the harder it falls when the foundation is wrong. I turned back toward my truck, gravel crunching again as I stepped off the pavement and onto what was still, undeniably, my land. I did not need to rush. I did not need to argue. All I had to do was wait. Let them finish. Let them sell. Let them celebrate what they thought they owned. And when everything was signed, sealed, and impossible to undo quietly, that is when I would say something. Not loudly, not emotionally, just once, in the right room, with the right paper, at the exact right moment. Because they did not just make a mistake. They committed to it 196 times in a row. The next few weeks moved quietly, almost too quietly, like the kind of calm that makes people forget to look down at what they are standing on. I went back to my routine, at least on the surface. Mornings in Austin, meetings, emails, coffee that tasted slightly burnt no matter where I bought it, the low hum of office air conditioning filling the background while people talked about timelines and budgets like they actually controlled outcomes. But every few days, I drove back out to the property. Not to interfere, not to question, just to watch. Each visit, something new had changed. Framing turned into siding. Dirt lots turned into trimmed lawns with fresh sod rolled out in perfect green strips. Street signs went up, identical, polished, anchored into ground that had never agreed to hold them. The smell shifted too. Less raw construction, more finished product. Paint, sealant, freshly cut grass. It started to look real. That was the dangerous part. Because once something looks real, people stop questioning how it got there. I parked further away now, keeping my truck off the main roads, walking in from the edge where the original land still felt untouched. From there, I could see everything without being seen too much. Families started showing up on weekends, walking through model homes, voices light, hopeful, talking about square footage and school districts and future plans. I heard laughter echo down streets that did not exist 6 months ago. I watched a couple stand in a driveway, pointing at where they wanted to park their cars, their kids running small circles around them, sneakers scuffing pavement that technically belonged to me. I did not interrupt. I did not correct them, because this was no longer just about Victoria Hale or the HOA. This had expanded into something layered, something tied to contracts and expectations and financial commitments far beyond a simple boundary line. I started collecting everything. Quietly. Public records of property sales as they began to close. Listings marked as sold. Mortgage filings tied to individual lots. Utility connections getting activated, water meters installed, electrical lines signed off by inspectors who trusted the paperwork in front of them. Every document added weight. Every signature tightened the structure they were building on top of that 12-foot shift. One afternoon, I stood near the same mailbox I had touched before, now with a car parked beside it, a temporary tag still taped to the back window. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, that faint metallic clicking sound you only notice when everything else is still. A woman stepped out of the house, holding a folder, probably closing documents, her face carrying that mix of relief and excitement people have when they believe they just secured something permanent. She smiled at me, polite, casual. "You looking to buy?" she asked. I shook my head once, returning the smile just enough to be normal. "No," I said, "just passing through." And that was the truth again. I was passing through a version of reality that had not caught up with itself yet. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across perfectly aligned driveways, I could see it more clearly than ever. They were almost done. The development was no longer an idea. It was a completed statement. And statements like that, once challenged, do not collapse quietly. I turned away and walked back toward the edge of the property, shoes brushing against dry grass that had never been moved, the original ground still steady under my feet. I checked my phone, scrolling through the files I had gathered, each one a piece of a structure that looked strong but was built slightly out of place. I did not feel rushed. I did not feel angry. If anything, I felt patient. Because the final step was already happening without me lifting a finger. They were finishing it for me. Every house sold. Every contract signed. Every family moved in. They were not just building homes anymore. They were locking themselves into the mistake, one decision at a time. By the time the first moving trucks started arriving before sunrise, I knew the window had closed. Not for them. For me. The moment to stop this quietly had passed somewhere between the last inspection sign-off and the first set of keys changing hands. Now it was something else entirely. I sat in my truck parked along the far edge of the property, engine off, windows cracked just enough to let the early morning air in. It carried the faint smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with coffee drifting from open garage doors. The neighborhood sounded different now. No more nail guns or heavy machinery. Just car doors shutting, footsteps on driveways, distant voices calling out directions as people unloaded boxes labeled kitchen or fragile. Life had started here. That was the point where most people would hesitate, where they would question whether it was worth it to push back, to disrupt something that already looked settled. I watched a man carefully carry a flat-screen television through his front door, stepping over the threshold like he was crossing into something permanent. I watched a kid drag a bicycle across the sidewalk, the plastic wheels scraping lightly against the concrete. Small details, ordinary moments, and all of it sitting on a foundation that was 12 feet off. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up the folder I had been building, thick now, edges worn from being handled over and over. Inside was everything. The original deed, my father's survey maps, the revised boundary filing, the zoning approvals tied to that incorrect survey, the mortgage records already locked into place. Each document layered on top of the last, forming a structure just as real as the houses outside my windshield. I flipped through the pages slowly, the soft sound of paper sliding against paper steady and controlled. No gaps, no missing pieces, just a straight line from truth to mistake. And that is when I made the decision. Not emotional, not rushed, just clear. I was not going to confront Victoria Hale in the street. I was not going to argue with construction managers or knock on doors explaining boundary law to families who had nothing to do with how this started. That would have been noise. And noise gets ignored. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened the county court website, the screen glowing softly in the dim morning light. Filing a case is not dramatic. It is quiet. A series of forms, names, parcel numbers, claims stated in precise language that does not raise its voice but carries weight. I entered everything exactly as it needed to be. Plaintiff, Lucas Grant. Defendant, Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, along with associated development entities tied to the filings I had already verified. Basis of claim, property encroachment based on inaccurate survey documentation resulting in unauthorized construction on legally owned land. I attached copies of the documents one by one, watching the progress bar fill as each file uploaded. It took less than 15 minutes. 15 minutes to set something in motion that would reach far beyond this parking spot, far beyond this street, far beyond the 196 homes now standing in neat rows under a rising Texas sun. When I hit submit, there was no sound, no alert, just a confirmation number appearing on the screen, small and unremarkable. That was the beginning. I set the phone down and looked back out at the neighborhood, at the people moving into a version of ownership that had not been tested yet. The sun climbed higher, light catching on windows and freshly painted siding, making everything look stable, complete, finished. But I knew something they did not. This was not the end of construction. This was the beginning of correction. And correction, when it finally arrives, does not care how comfortable things have become. The first letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, folded clean, stamped official, the kind of envelope people hesitate to open because they already know it carries something they cannot ignore. I was not there when it landed in their mailboxes, but I imagined it clearly. The slight pause at the front door, the sound of paper tearing, the shift in the air as words settled in. Legal notice, property boundary dispute, pending court review. It does not take long for something like that to spread. By the time I drove out there that evening, the neighborhood felt different. Not loud, not chaotic, just unsettled. Conversations were quieter. People stood a little longer in driveways, papers in hand, voices low, trying to make sense of something that did not fit the picture they had just bought into. I parked in the same spot along the edge, stepping out into air that felt heavier than usual, like a storm was coming but had not broken yet. The hum of normal life was still there, cars pulling in, garage doors opening. But underneath it, there was something new. Doubt. I walked slowly along the outer line, keeping distance, observing without inserting myself. A man stood near his mailbox, reading the same page over and over, his jaw tightening slightly each time like the words might change if he gave them enough chances. A woman stood a few houses down, phone pressed to her ear, pacing in short steps, her free hand moving in sharp gestures that carried frustration even without hearing a single word. They were starting to ask questions. Not about me. Not yet. About the paperwork they trusted. About the signatures they assumed meant security. About the invisible lines no one had shown them. That is how it begins. Not with confrontation. With confusion. I stopped near the curb of what used to be the southern boundary and looked down the street again. The same clean alignment. The same perfect spacing, now carrying a different weight. Every house looked the same as it did yesterday, but the meaning had shifted. Ownership is a fragile thing when it depends on accuracy. I could feel eyes on me now, a few people noticing I did not quite belong to the flow of the neighborhood, my presence just outside the pattern. One of them approached, cautious, holding that letter like it might answer itself if asked the right way. "Do you know anything about this?" he asked, voice controlled but edged with something tight underneath. I looked at the paper briefly, then back at him. "Yeah," I said calmly. "I do." He waited for more, but I did not offer it. Not yet. Because this was not the moment for explanations. This was the moment for realization. He nodded slowly, uncertainty settling deeper, and stepped back, glancing down the street like he was seeing it differently for the first time. I continued walking, the faint crunch of gravel returning as I moved off the pavement and back onto the original ground. The line still there whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Behind me, conversations picked up, sharper now, faster, threads connecting between neighbors, questions stacking on top of each other. The structure was still standing, but the certainty inside it was starting to shift. And once that happens, it does not reverse. I reached my truck and paused for a moment, looking out across the rows of houses catching the last light of the day. They had built something impressive. Organized. complete. But now it carried something else too. Awareness. And awareness, once introduced, spreads faster than anything they ever constructed here. The notice did not stay contained for long. By the next morning, it had spread beyond front porches and kitchen tables and into places that carried weight. Bank calls, title companies, insurance offices. The kind of conversations that start polite and then slowly tighten as the implications become harder to ignore. I was sitting at a small table in a quiet coffee shop in Austin when my phone buzzed for the third time in under an hour, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number each time. I let it ring out, not because I did not know who it was, but because timing matters. Across from me, a man stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, the metal spoon clinking softly against ceramic, a steady rhythm that matched the way everything was beginning to move. Slow at first, then faster. I opened my folder again, spreading a few pages out on the table, the original deed resting on top, heavier than everything else, not just in paper, but in meaning. Clean lines, verified coordinates, filed decades before anyone in that neighborhood ever thought about building anything. Underneath it, the revised survey. Clean too. Professional. Wrong. That 12-foot shift did not look like much on paper. Just a slight adjustment. A technical correction. But in reality, it cut straight through foundations, driveways, living rooms. It turned ownership into a question. And questions like that do not stay small. By mid-afternoon, the first official response came. Not from homeowners. From the developers. A formal statement filed in court, language carefully constructed, confident, dismissive. They called it a clerical discrepancy. A minor boundary variation. They requested dismissal. That was expected. What they did not expect was what came next. The supporting documents I had submitted were not opinions. They were records. Filed. Stamped. Verified. And once those entered the system, they triggered something automatic. Review. Independent verification. A second set of eyes that did not belong to them. That is when the tone started to change. I drove back out that evening, the sky dimming into a deep orange as the sun dropped low, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. The energy was different now. Not confusion anymore. Movement. Groups of people standing together, comparing documents, pointing at lines, at maps, at the edges of properties they thought they understood. Cars parked unevenly along the street. Doors left open longer than usual. Conversations stretching out instead of ending quickly. I stepped out of my truck and walked along the outer boundary again, the original ground steady under my feet, the contrast sharp against the structured layout just a few feet away. Near the center of the development, I saw Victoria Hale. She stood perfectly composed, dressed like she always was, controlled, measured, speaking to a small group with calm authority. But even from a distance, I could see it. The slight tension in her posture. The way her hands stayed just a little too still. She was managing perception, not reality. Because reality had already started shifting. A man raised his voice slightly, not aggressive, just frustrated, holding up a document, asking a question that did not have an easy answer. Another voice joined in. Then another. Not chaos. Pressure. The kind that builds slowly and evenly until something gives. I kept walking, not toward them, not away, just along the line that had always been there, watching how quickly certainty was turning into doubt. This was the part most people misunderstand. The collapse does not start with a loud moment. It starts quietly, in documents, in conversations, in the space between what people believed and what they are forced to accept. And once that gap opens, it does not close on its own. I reached the far edge of the property and stopped, turning back one more time. The houses still stood exactly the same. The streets still ran straight. The lights flickered on one by one as evening settled in. But underneath it all, something had changed. The structure was no longer solid. It was being questioned. And once something like that enters the system, it moves forward on its own, step by step, page by page, until it reaches the only place it can end. Not in the street, not in conversation, but in a room where lines are not suggested. They are decided. The courtroom did not feel dramatic when I walked in. No raised voices. No tension hanging in the air like people imagine. Just quiet. Controlled. The soft shuffle of papers, the low hum of air conditioning, the faint scent of polished wood and old files that have passed through too many hands to count. I took my seat without looking around too much, setting the folder down in front of me with a steady hand. Across the room, Victoria Hale sat with her legal team, posture straight, expression composed, the same confidence she carried on that street now placed carefully inside four walls. Around us, representatives from the developers, a few homeowners, and people from the county offices filled the seats, all drawn into something that had grown larger than any one of them expected. The case was called without ceremony. Names read. Appearances noted. It started the way these things always do. Language precise. Arguments structured. The opposing side spoke first, presenting the same position they had filed earlier. Clerical discrepancy. Minor variation. No material impact. They spoke cleanly, confidently, like they had said these words enough times to believe them. I listened without interruption, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath them. When it was my turn, I did not stand right away. I opened the folder slowly, the sound of paper sliding against paper cutting through the quiet just enough to shift attention. I pulled out one document and placed it on the table in front of me. Then another. Then a third. Each one aligned carefully, edges straight, nothing rushed. The original deed. My father's survey. The revised filing. The courtroom did not change in volume, but it changed in focus. I stood then, finally, picking up the first document, holding it just high enough to be seen but not displayed like a performance. This is the recorded deed, I said, voice even, measured, filed and verified. These are the original boundaries. I set it down and picked up the second. This is the certified survey conducted prior to development. It matches the deed. Then the third. And this is the revised survey used for approval. I paused there, not for effect, but because the space between those documents mattered more than anything I could add. They do not match. That was it. No long explanation. No raised tone. Just a statement that connected everything already in front of them. The judge leaned forward slightly, eyes moving between the documents, then to the supplemental records that had already been entered into evidence. The room stayed quiet, but it was no longer neutral. It was shifting. Questions followed, directed not at me, but across the room. Clarifications requested. Dates confirmed. Measurements compared. 12 feet. Repeated more than once. Not as an opinion. As a fact. I stepped back, hands resting at my sides, watching as the structure they built in paperwork began to separate under its own weight. Not collapsing. Not yet. But no longer holding together the way it had outside this room. The realization moved slowly at first, then all at once. Because once the line is established, everything attached to it has to answer to it. The houses, the contracts, the approvals, all of it, tied to something that was never where they said it was. I did not need to say anything else. The documents had already done the work. I returned to my seat, closing the folder with a soft, final sound, and looked forward as the process continued without me. Because this was never about winning an argument. It was about placing the truth exactly where it belonged. And once it is there, everything else has to adjust around it.